I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation. On the day he was named Indigenous Services Minister, he gave a speech in Mohawk. His first days as minister saw him faced with a suicide crisis in Saskatchewan, and then a looming compensation order by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Soon, blockades popped up across the country in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people, bringing many parts of Canada to a halt for weeks. Then, just when that looked to be quieting down, COVID-19 quickly spread across the world and eventually into First Nations. Minister Miller joins Nation on her final episode of the season. Welcome to the show, Minister Miller.
Thank you, Todd, for having me on.
How has it been making policy in crisis almost from the very first day you were sworn in?
Well, it's been eye-opening, frankly. You obviously never want to be part of a team that only does public policy by crisis because it makes for bad policy. For better or for worse, the department that the Prime Minister has asked me to lead has faced a number of crises, and if you look even over the year prior to my nomination, historic wildfires and flooding that create that atmosphere. But it's been a big learning experience, and now what with COVID and prior to that, barricades across the country that were threatening and had in fact shut down a good part of the economy. It's quite a task to take on, but it's something that my team has been able to react quickly to. The department, for better or for worse, does have that muscle memory that allows it to react quickly. And what I've asked it to do, and what my team has asked it to do over the past few months, has been truly remarkable from my perspective. But it's always with the goal of ensuring that the relationship that our government has with Indigenous peoples is one that can progressively get better. And we can only do that through constant attention, constant relationship building. And while the general public has seen these as crises, they've also been opportunities to open that dialogue and further the relationship. And I think we've have been able to make some modest progress, frankly. And if you look at some of the amazing work that's been done by Indigenous communities in preparing for and stamping out COVID in some communities, it's been truly remarkable to see, but it's not something we take for granted.
You must have knew it was never going to be easy when you went into that meeting with the Prime Minister to accept the position. What were your thoughts when you left that room?
It was an interesting meeting. It was kind of a meeting I accepted with some trepidation. These are not positions that you can accept or decline. The negotiation room is very thin. You can imagine. But I knew and I would learn to appreciate the magnitude of it. But I knew that Indigenous service was an area of our relationship that needed work. We had indeed committed to it. The Prime Minister has said and remains committed to it as our most important relationship. But it isn't an easy one, and it's one that predates Canada and has been difficult from the very beginning. That for anyone that has the privilege to be asked to become a minister, there's a week where you're kind of living in your own bubble, trying not to tell anyone. And there were a number of things that I was reflecting on. I told my family, obviously my children and my wife, had taken away all the devices from my kids so they couldn't text anyone. But I looked on it in a very sort of introverted way, and it sort of marked me throughout that week, thinking about how I would deal with things. And obviously, from day one, with various issues and crises coming up, it certainly was, and even more so, what I anticipated.
I suppose the first day that when you sat down at the desk as Indigenous Services Minister, what was the number one things on your list that you needed to tackle?
Well, the first, you mentioned it in introduction, Todd. We were facing the unfortunate passing of a youth through suicide in Saskatchewan. I had another briefing on Grassy Narrows, and another one on the CHRT decision, which I'm sure you'll probably ask me about. And so these are three very large, challenging issues, monetary to say the least, but also on a human level with respect to some of the most vulnerable communities in Canada. So it kind of hit me with its full weight, and then the various briefing binders. And I do read quickly, but I did get an immense amount of reading material from the department so that I could get up to speed, because obviously, if you don't know what position you're being named to, you don't have the opportunity to prepare in depth with the department. And so it was a week of solid briefings and managing a number of issues that were coming to the fore, particularly with respect to suicide in Saskatchewan, and demands from national organizations to deal with it.
Just to touch again upon what you just said about the suicide crisis in Saskatchewan, do you feel that has been solved now?
With suicide, it falls into a spectrum of mental health challenges, and the challenge that we have as a government is recognizing that the solutions are within the community. The causes are multifaceted, very profound, very deep-rooted, whether it's historical trauma, whether it is any issues touching mental health. So absolutely not resolved. But what we did know and what we did see and recognize is that groups like FSIN had suicide prevention strategies that were unfunded for the most part. And so we moved quickly to provide financial resources to FSIN to put together its strategy and put into effect its strategy for dealing with issues in and around suicide, ideation, mental wellness, and to get a better sense of what is out there. A lot of these issues haven't arisen overnight. It's no surprise to anyone.
Now, last week we spoke to Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, on our show, and I was surprised that she's still working on upcoming Human Rights Tribunal sittings. Why hasn't this been settled yet?
Well, again, in that spirit, Todd, of not prosecuting things in the public domain and negotiating things in the public domain, I will say that from the very beginning we recognized that we did need to continue a dialogue outside the courtroom with Dr. Blackstock, and this is why I asked Valerie Gideon, my ADM, to intervene and to start working towards what the court had asked us to do, which was to put forward a model on compensation in the context of the CHRT decision. At the same time, and your listeners will well know, there was a class action case that overlapped to some extent and included some of the children covered by the CHRT decision, as well as another one that came up. And so it is a multifaceted challenge to be talking to three groups of counsel and to be attempting to come to a form of resolution that recognizes, obviously, what we've said from the very beginning is that First Nations children will be compensated. Now, that progress at the CHRT level has been very positive. Now, when you have entrenched groups and positions with views, some will have differing ones, and there remain a number of elements that are still outstanding. But we've made, and I don't want to leave this interview without saying that there has been substantial progress. I think Dr. Blackstock would recognize that is the case too. She would say that's not enough, and these are the conversations that are ongoing. I did have a chance to speak to her last week on a number of long-term reforms that are still part and parcel of that discussion, and I have hope, but we're not out of the woods right yet, particularly since there are three separate cases that largely concern the same class of claimants, and so that will require more discussion, more negotiation outside the public outside the public sphere.
Of course, Dr. Blackstock doesn't understand why we've seen so many billions of dollars spent on emergency relief for COVID-19. Why can't the government do this? After all, you must understand there are parents and children who could use that money.
Well, this is an ongoing discussion about ensuring that the things that we said as a government we would keep going in this in a COVID-19 environment, and what constitutes that new normal is very, very difficult to predict. I don't think there's anyone credible that could predict exactly where we'll be in a month from now. But we do know we need to keep going with the agenda of ensuring that we close the inequities between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. obviously, the resources that we've deployed as a government to combat COVID-19 are emergency-like in their nature and have been deployed under that atmosphere. But it doesn't change us from doing things that are very important. And even in a COVID-19 context, we moved quite quickly to extend funding for children that were aging out of care, and Dr. Blackstock should take credit for that because she was a strong advocate for making sure that we did that. But we also have to have those discussions about compensation, about moving forward under a new normal, and what that looks like. I have some sense, but I think that thought process still has not matured in a lot of people's mind, and it's work to do, frankly, over the next few months, and how we move forward some of the government agenda and things that were in the speech from the throne.
On that thought, we have to take a break, but we'll be right back with more from Indigenous Services Minister Marc Miller. Welcome back. We are speaking to Minister Marc Miller, and just before the break we discussed some of the early issues he faced upon being sworn in last November. Things would only pick up from there. Minister Miller, pretty quickly Canada found itself in a lockdown with blockades. What was that like for you?
Well, I think we all recognize as a government, as the solidarity movement for the Wet'suwet'en was developing across the country, that it was important to intervene federally, and this is our duty when we see issues arising that are compelling to all Canadians. These are also issues that are specific to the Crown Indigenous relation that I and Minister Bennett must, as the principal custodians of that relationship, must move forward. And so when it came to shutting down various train routes, some that were integral to our economy, it was very important to have federal intervention. So when it came to going and discussing with the people that were at the barricades in Tyendinaga, I decided to go after consulting with my team. Most importantly, to make sure that we had the right dialogue and were crystal clear as to what asks were, what demands were, what requests were, and to make sure that we had that relationship that obviously had, the reason everyone was there was a reflection of breakdown of trust and some issues that we had some differences over. And so that meant direct contact with a group of people that haven't felt necessarily respected by the Canadian government for some time. Not an easy decision, but something that was very important to do, to understand where people entrench themselves in positions and decide to take things that frankly put the livelihoods of Canadians at risk, but also their lives. Being beside a train track is quite dangerous. This is something that we should never take lightly. It starts with dialogue and should always end with dialogue. And if we look at the painful experience of our past, whether it's the Oka crisis or Ipperwash, these have ended sometimes in bloodshed, and that is not something that should ever happen. And so if you look at your relationship, the nation-to-nation relationship that the Prime Minister talks about, that is something that moving forward is something we need to work harder at. And that, I think, was my takeaway from that relationship, talking for 8 hours, even though nothing concrete came of it on that day, built some trust. It built an understanding for what the issues were, and built a set of parameters where we could keep that relationship and dialogue open should things change quickly. The worst thing that can happen in any sort of crisis is for the lines of communication to break down, because that's when things happen that you will obviously regret. And so, I was cautiously optimistic coming out of that meeting. I think Minister Bennett with her team was cautiously optimistic at the ongoing discussions she had with the Wet'suwet'en. But the most important thing we had to realize federally is we needed to take the time to listen and take the time to listen, act, and do things in a fashion that respected people's decision-making process, whether it's the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership and their process, their very deliberative process of coming to a decision, or whether it's the way the Mohawk Nation deliberates, discusses, and has a consensus-based model that we're not necessarily familiar with in order to take a decision, which ultimately was, from their perspective, the right decision.
Now, we all know a memorandum of understanding would eventually be worked out with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, but now the elected chiefs are against it. How do you solve that?
Well, I believe it will be solved the same way it probably should have been solved at the very beginning, which is letting the Wet'suwet'en people decide. The band council system created under the Indian Act has had a number of criticisms over the years. It has created a form of governance that hasn't garnered unanimity. There are many communities that have been able to reconcile that fact, and there are many that haven't. In the case of the Wet'suwet'en people, they fall into the category of people that have always had a number of objections, and that was enshrined, at least in the Canadian legal system, since Delgamuukw. And so we spent 20 years kind of chewing on what that actually means. And this memorandum of understanding, while it doesn't prejudice the band council's rights, it certainly creates a governance system that, or has a potentiality to create a governance system that needs to garner the support of the Wet'suwet'en people. And so if you're coming from the federal government's perspective, where the federal government has consciously in the past played an active role in dismantling or destroying these hereditary systems, you can't suddenly dictate the pace and time of how this moves forward. So the Memorandum of Understanding is historic in nature, but it is also very much the beginning of a process where over the course of a year, the Wet'suwet'en people, through the hereditary leadership or band councils, will have to have those difficult discussions, and they aren't for me to judge what nature and form they will take. But certainly it does create a level of uncertainty within their community that we can't dismiss. But it is, in fact, we also can't dismiss the fact that memorandum of understanding has been 23 years, even longer in the making, and it's something that is historic in nature and reflects something that we haven't done in the past, which is the ability to have those discussions and to come to a point where you can actually ratify that as a document that has teeth. But we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination, because this will need to take, it is a couple pager in what's written down. It'll have to sort out a number of governance items that deal with a territory that is vast.
That lockdown, of course, would spill into another one with the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's been a couple hundred cases on reserve. Can you say that the worst is now over?
No. What we have seen at the very beginning is Indigenous communities taking this very seriously, and the reason that they've been so successful is, yes, a function of remoteness, but also a function of being able to react, prepare, get that public health message out, which is so key. I mean, in some of the communities where they've had the greatest success in preventing the spread of COVID are communities where health leadership has taken the front scene in making sure that people are washing their hands, social distancing is taking place, respect for elders, or elders' homes in the case where there are elders' homes in the community, and learning from some of the mistakes that have been made in urban contexts like Montreal and Toronto. It's all to their credit, and while the federal government has deployed significant resources to help, the seriousness with which First Nations Indigenous leadership has taken this threat of COVID-19 is truly remarkable. As of today, there are 171 of the 200 or so cases that are considered recovered, and yes, that is remarkable. But as we know, with all these pandemics, before a vaccine is created and distributed, there is the potential of a second or even third waves. And we look back at H1N1, and the second wave was more devastating than the first when it comes to Indigenous communities. So that's something that we keep at the top of our minds, knowing that the risk of propagation still exists. If you look at the various serology reports around the world, they are showing a very low penetration of the virus, which means that it can spread within the communities still. And so that risk is very real, and it's a risk that everyone should take seriously, particularly as we try to get a little bit smarter about how we go about our daily lives and what the new normal is under COVID-19. And that's something that comes with a lot of risk. And so, that if you want to talk about the federal government's involvement in that, that means constant outreach with our health teams to make sure that the proper PPE is available, the nursing stations are well stocked. We are in constant communication with leadership, and if and when COVID-19 gets into a community, that you're able to act aggressively, and we know that if you're able to act within a 24, 48-hour period, you can actually isolate and stomp it out. Gulf Bay is an example, Imatong is an example, Laloche, that we're starting to see the results of, that had one of the most significant spreads of COVID-19, looks like it has been arrested to some extent. So this is all due to local leadership and aggressive intervention, and is something that should be highlighted.
Early in our conversation, you mentioned your family. So at some point you go home and you take off your minister's hat at the door. Do you wish people could see that side of you more often?
Well, that depends. There's some sides I probably don't want them to see, but if that stuff that with my family that I try to keep private, but I'd be glad anytime if someone wanted to step into my home and have a good laugh at how certainly my kids don't consider me to be a minister, and call me out when I'm full of it. So. Maybe that would amuse your listeners at some point, or your viewers. But again, I do like to keep my private life private. But I got 3 kids and a wife that tell me what the deal is when I get home, and I'm certainly not very high on that pecking order.
You're talking about your private life, and of course, in private life, you've been longtime friends with Prime Minister Trudeau. What's the one thing he did that perhaps you didn't like when it comes to Indigenous people?
Well, that's interesting you mentioned that, Todd, because we actually keep our relationship business and then kind of when we chill together. So the issues that we tackle are radically different. You know, he's not. You know, if I were to treat him like the Prime Minister every time we hung out, it probably wouldn't be conducive to a good relationship. So we tend not to discuss, I guess, business when we're just hanging out. But I think all in all, he's got a good heart. He's someone that trusts the people around him to do the work that is part of the government's mandate. And so, he's certainly someone that has asked me to do a job and has largely deferred in the way that I do it to my judgment, and I believe he's done the same with Minister Bennett. So on that angle, while we do have disagreements quite often on Indigenous issues, actually we haven't had that many that I could recall for your listeners.
Okay, Minister Miller, I want to thank you for spending the whole show with us, and we'll see where things go over the summer.
Thanks, Todd. Have a good summer.
Thank you. We'll have more after another short break. Well, that's Nation to Nation for a while as we go on a break for the summer. I hope everyone is staying healthy, practicing your social distancing if possible, and keeping your kids and grandchildren occupied. It certainly hasn't been easy these past 2 months, but it's been a pleasure to come into the office and do this show during that time. And we will be back in October. So have a great summer. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.